Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at how various minority groups in the 60s and 70s try to get equality. So there were a lot of minority groups that also tried to get equal rights in the 60s and 70s, and really what happens is because the civil rights movement was so influential and it was so successful, other minority groups are going to see these successes and they are also going to become empowered to look and try and get equality and to be treated fairly. And there's four of these groups that we're going to focus on today. One is going to be women. The second is going to be Native Americans. The third is Hispanics. And fourth is the LGBTQ community. And all of these are going to see how the civil rights movement really was organized and how it reached successes, and it's going to take parts of those to further their own success in their trying to get equal rights. So we're first going to talk about Latinos or Hispanics. Coming into the 60s and the 70s, but really you can see it start in the late 1940s, 1950s, Latinos and Hispanics are going to demand greater representation in the government. They are also going to want equal opportunities and respect for their culture and their heritage. A lot of their demands are going to be the same as what we saw in the civil rights movement for African Americans. Hispanics also face segregation, especially in the West, and so they are going to also try and get desegregation to go through. So the man that you're looking at is Cesar Chavez, and he is one of the leaders of the Hispanic rights movement, and he is going to be one of the biggest pushes for Hispanics being able to get equality. So Cesar Chavez believed that farm workers had to unionize. He saw the conditions that the farm workers in California were living under, the super poor conditions, the treatment, and he believed that the only way for these farm workers to find safe and profitable working conditions was for them to band together. When farm workers had tried to get fair wages and tried to get safe working conditions before this, they had been met with violence and it hadn't happened. So Chavez is going to try and get all of these farm workers to unionize and to have one big group effort. He was a firm believer in nonviolence, and so you're going to see that the things that he does are all nonviolent protests, much like what Dr. Martin Luther King was doing. He's going to form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee. This was to help get better wages for farm workers. This is a younger picture of Cesar Chavez. So now we're just going to watch a couple of short videos on the Hispanic rights movement.
In the 1940s, in Delano, California, as in most American towns, people lived segregated lives. Even at the local movie house, where whites sat in the middle and everyone else sat on the sides. Then one day, things changed.
In 1946, there was a young guy by the name of Sisi. He was a Pachuco, he was a zoo tutor, who went off to the Navy, came back, put on his civvies, and went to the movies. And since he was serving his country, he felt that he had a right to sit wherever he wanted, so he came and sat in the middle. He wouldn't move, so the police arrested him. There was no law that said you couldn't sit in the middle, so they couldn't charge him with anything, not even disturbing the peace. He was pretty peaceful. So they grilled him for a couple hours and then released him. And everybody noticed. They said, hey, CC got away with it. He was sat in the middle. So the following week, everybody sat in the middle section. And the town movie house was desegregated. And that happened across the entire valley. Some 20 years later, when I told my mom I was going back to Delano to work with the union, she says, oh, you're going to work with Sisi. And I said, Sisi? Is that Vato still around? And she says, mijo, don't you know who Sisi is? He's Cesar Chavez.
In the 1960s, Cesar Chavez would become the most significant Mexican-American leader of his generation. He would join forces with Dolores Huerta to champion the human rights of some of America's poorest workers.
The workers were literally like slaves. The living conditions were horrendous, and the children were barefoot. And I thought, well, this is so wrong.
Their success would ignite a movement challenging a long history of prejudice and injustice. In East Los Angeles, a high school teacher led the largest student walkout in history, risking his own freedom to give Mexican-American students a chance at a quality education.
It was a risk, it was a gamble, but the gamble that had to be taken. We're trying to make schools better, trying to make the country better.
In Crystal City, Texas, a graduate student founded a political party, transforming centuries of oppression into ethnic power.
Reckless, yes. Dangerous, extremely. Did it pay off? Damn right.
And in San Antonio, a young activist brought millions of Mexican Americans who had never voted to the polls, eventually doubling the number of Latinos elected to political office.
Because of his will, his sheer will, we became a part of the American system.
During the 1960s and 70s, a whole generation of Mexican Americans discovered a new sense of pride as they fought for equality and challenged America to accept them on their own terms.
Cesar Estrada Chavez, an American civil rights activist and labor leader, was born in Yuma, Arizona on March 31, 1927. The Chavez family lost their Arizona homestead in the Great Depression, and in the late 1930s moved to Northern California.
Cesar and his family became migrant farm workers thrust into the industrialized agriculture of California.
Cesar dropped out of school after the 8th grade to help support his family by working in the fields.
Cesar joined the Navy right after World War II, and he saw places he never would have seen, so it did open his eyes up to the world very much.
After the Navy, Chavez returned to the fields and became a grassroots organizer for a Latino civil rights group. He then left the group and formed the National Farm Workers Association, now known as the United Farm Workers of America, with the goal of unionizing farm workers.
Cesar believed that the movement he founded had to be more than just a union that was solely concerned with improving wages, hours, and working conditions, although the UFW certainly did that. But it also needed to address the crippling dilemmas that farm workers face in the community after they came home from work.
Most people were poor. They didn't have access to good housing or health care or education.
Chavez was adamant that his new union follow a strict policy of using only nonviolent tactics as a means of negotiation. While the organization was still in its infancy, UFW embarked upon one of the most influential boycotts in U.S. history, the boycott of all California table grapes.
The grape boycott really took off in '68. Cesar had studied history. He knew that for 100 years, farm worker strikes were brutally crushed, and that the agricultural industry, which in California is one of the richest and most powerful industries in the state, controlled much of rural California. So what Cesar needed to do was take the fight from the fields, where the odds were stacked against the farm workers, and move it to the cities, where the farm workers at least had a chance.
Over the next few years, led by Cesar Chavez, the farm workers would boycott, protest, march, and fast their way to a collective bargaining agreement, which guaranteed field workers, among other things, increased pay and the right to unionize.
He was responsible for a lot of the labor codes that we see today, the protections, the benefits, but the basic right to organize and affiliate.
As the head of the United Farm Workers of America, labor rights was not the only cause championed by Chavez.
Cesar's commitment to social justice went far beyond the farm workers. In the 1960s, he was a strong and vocal opponent of the Vietnam War. In the 1970s, Cesar was an early and vocal supporter of gay rights. Also not a popular position, especially at that time, among his own constituency.
Cesar Chavez died in his sleep on April 23, 1993. He was survived by his wife Helen, their 8 children, and 31 grandchildren. In 1994, he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bill Clinton.
In 1975, there was a reporter with a national news magazine following Caesar around for several days, rallies, marches, picket lines. And in an interview, she asked him what accounts for all the affection and respect that farm workers show you in public. And Caesar paused for a moment, and then he smiled his easy smile, and he said, "The feeling is mutual."
So that was just kind of an overview of the Hispanic rights movement. So part of this that we're talking about when we're talking about Hispanic rights was there was a political group named Viva La Raza, and La Raza is going to be a Latino political party, and the focus was on getting more Hispanics into political offices, helping more Hispanics get out there to vote. They're going to push the Brown Power idea, the Brown Power movement, and also looking for bilingual education programs in schools, more opportunities for Hispanic children, pushing to have their culture represented and treated fairly. And what we're going to see with La Raza is that there will be a lot more Hispanics that are voting and are represented within the government. So the next group we're going to talk about is Native Americans, and Native Americans seeking equality and fair treatment. What's going to happen is that Eisenhower put into the termination policy, and a lot of Native Americans are going to be removed and lose their land from the reservations. Native American culture wasn't being represented in schools. There wasn't a lot of emphasis put on looking at history from the Native American perspective. And Native Americans were facing some really bad conditions on reservations. And so what's going to happen is that a group of Native Americans is going to get together and demand change. They wanted respect for their culture, they wanted equal rights, they wanted fair treatment. They wanted to be treated like everyone else. And so we get to what's called the American Indian Movement, or AIM. This is going to be a group of young Native Americans who want reform, and they want it fast. It's going to kind of start out as a self-defense group against police brutality, and then it's going to be going into protecting the rights of Native Americans, respecting their culture, making the treaties that were made be respected and upheld. AIM was actually founded in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's an advocacy group. It addresses issues such as sovereignty, leadership, treaties. Sovereignty means who is in charge. Really, especially in its early years, it protested racism, and it fought for civil rights, all for Native Americans. The Trail of Broken Treaties was a march on Washington, D.C. to protest treaty violations and to get rid of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. AIM will take over the BIA building. They'll destroy records as a form of protest. In 1973, AIM is going to take over the town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota. This was the site of a horrific massacre against Native Americans. They will take hostages. There's going to be a shootout with the FBI. 2 Native Americans were killed. So it ends with a lot of violence and disaster. But let's watch how AIM begins and the positive effects that AIM has.
And the reason for Dennis Banks and Clyde Balcour to be part of the formation of the movement was they were in prison, and they saw the racism going on right in the prison. There was no religious freedom rights, and And so I think they came out of the prison, the institutions, with a determination to change what they had experienced.
And I kind of chaired the first meeting, saying that we have to do something about the police brutality, about the slum housing conditions, high unemployment that we're in, and the more we talked, the more people started to ask questions. Then there was one guy out there in the audience who was saying, "Well, what kind of action are we going to do?" And I'd say, "Well, we've got to form a committee. We're sick of committees. Well, these committees don't do nothing." So everything that I was talking about was being challenged by this guy, and the guy, of course, I knew, and that was Clyde Belcourt, and he wanted action right now. And we said, okay, we're going to go do it tomorrow morning. Well, we said, well, maybe Monday we can go meet with the police. No, we want to go tomorrow morning. So I said, all right, who wants to go tomorrow morning? So they formed people to go see the police chief right now.
We were all there at this meeting, and so we brought together, I guess, the summation of all our lives, all our experiences at a time when I always expressed it that we were about to be written out of history as roadkill cultures of manifest destiny.
It was called the Indian and White America. And the statistics that came out of the study was basically that Indians were living to be 44.5 years of age. That the average income on most reservations was between $1,500 and $2,000 a year. That unemployment on most reservations was as high as 80–90%. The housing, that I think at the time 40% of the American Indian housing didn't even have electricity. Nationally, and some reservations was higher than that. Dene Nation in particular, Navajo. The educational level of attainment for Indian students was 8.5 grades. So all these conditions were probably, and there was no question, they were the worst conditions in terms of social measurement of any ethnic group in America.
So that video kind of gives you an overview of what the founders were seeing at this point and what their push was and the need for Native American civil rights, for a Native American civil rights movement. And the result of this is that the U.S. government did give tribes a lot more control on reservations. Some lands were returned to Native Americans, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. There are still court cases that come up about treaty violations from the U.S. government, and so this is once again an ongoing movement. Next, we're going to talk about feminism. So, during the 1960s, women are going to see that other minorities are seeking equal treatment, fair pay, civil rights, and women are going to want this equality too. And this leads to the second wave of feminism. And feminism, this is an important term, is the belief that women should have the same economic, political, and social equality as men. Feminism believes that men and women should be equal, have equal rights, be treated the same, be treated fairly. And this second wave of feminism is really going to be started and really get pushed by Betty Friedan's book on the feminine mystique and the things that she saw that women weren't having the opportunities to do. There were still a lot of jobs in the 1960s that were considered men's work that women weren't allowed to do. JFK is going to do a commission on the status of women. He's going to find that women were paid less than men. They weren't usually promoted, no matter how qualified they were. that women still weren't receiving fair treatment. And so this is really going to be women pushing. There's going to be a push to get more women into politics. The National Organization of Women, or NOW, is going to be created, and this is going to push for child care centers and to enforce the ban on gender discrimination when hiring. NOW will be instrumental on getting women equal rights in the workplace. Gloria Steinem is going to be another one of the main leaders in the second wave of feminism. She's going to speak out on women's rights and discrimination. She's going to help found the National Women's Political Caucus, which was encouraging women to run for office, like I said before. And she's going to create Ms. Magazine, which was a magazine which was devoted to the issues that women were. And this is Gloria Steinem. Some other things that they're going to push for are going to be getting birth control. We're going to see the Higher Education Act goes into effect, bans gender discrimination. A lot of all-male colleges are now have to be opened up to women. We see, as a result of this, women working in every field. The number of women graduates and those political offices also rises dramatically. The birth control pill would be made public in 1960. It was considered a real risque subject. It wasn't one that was spoken of in polite society. But this is going to kind of become a norm through music, through a song written by Loretta Lynn when she talked about this. This will also be the time that the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade comes into effect, which is still controversial today. So we're going to watch just a short overview on the second and now what is considered the third wave of feminism.
World War II was a beautiful moment. You know what I'm talking about. Strong women and Rosie the Riveter were everywhere, and while women, especially women of color, were still paid less and often only had pink-collar jobs, there were new ways to evaluate women's worth that weren't solely based on housewife virtues. But like all good things, this died. Once all the men came back from the war, women were told that yes, they were needed for jobs earlier, but it would be so nice if now they would just quietly return to their houses, pretty please. The 1950s saw the rise of perfect housewives trapped behind white picket fences. Emphasis on white. Women of color were facing very different issues.
Racism and sexism soared after World War II. Over the next 2 decades, the second wave of feminism would attack discrimination based on gender, especially in the workplace. The second wave found its initial surge from the civil rights movement, the New Left, and anti-war activists. Through those movements, women learned about activism, which they then brought to the feminist movement.
The second wave developed the slogan, "The personal is political." Women gathered in consciousness-raising groups where they shared personal experiences and realized that their problems were not their fault but mattered on a broader scale. Betty Friedan's feminine mystique burst onto the scene, putting to words the white middle-class experience. Second wave accomplishments are usually pretty well known. The Equal Pay Act, the founding of the National Organization of Women, or NOW, Title IX, and the historic Roe v. Wade case on abortion.
In spite of some successes, the second wave encountered real problems due to divisions within itself along lines of race, class, sexuality, and even between minority groups. These divisions fractured the movement, which disillusioned many feminists and society as a whole. That being said, there were many moments of great unity. Most of them just get removed from history's understanding.
So that's it. We're done. Oh, never mind. Patriarchy, like hell, is not easily conquered.
So then the 80s happened. Big hair, Prince, you know. And now feminism is dead, again. Not really, though. Sure, people stopped marching in the streets as frequently, but the emergence of a focus on intersectionality was definitely beginning. People were talking, it was just fewer people were listening. So it evolved into third wave, which is happening right now.
Third wave feminists saw the gaps of second, especially the lack of intersectionality. As a reaction, they built their own wave, usually said to have begun in the 1990s. They benefited a lot from the results of second wave feminism, but still had many complaints about both the still very not dead patriarchy and how feminism wasn't inclusive in the past. The focus of feminism shifted toward liberation and freedom rather than equality. This meant having the ability to choose, and subsequently not choose. The intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender are all a huge part.
Rather than emphasizing the collective, third wave feminism also looks at all women as individuals that can unify based not ignoring difference but by embracing it. As it is currently happening, it's hard to talk about long-term effects or lasting changes.
So it's just a short overview on the second and third waves of feminism. The last movement we're going to talk about is the gay liberation movement, and that was what it was called in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. What you're looking at, this man down here is Frank Kameny, and he's really going to be the leader for this movement. He was fired from his job from the federal government in the 1950s because they found out that he was gay. And so he is going to petition, and he's actually going to take it all the way to the Supreme Court. And his petition, which is called Petition Denied, Revolution Begun, petitions to the Supreme Court, this is going to be one of those founding things for this movement. What we see with the movement for the LGBTQ community is that there was always activism, but it wasn't widespread. A lot of people were afraid of consequences, but as more and more people began to see these other minorities taking action and seeing results, it's going to begin to push this movement also. But there's one big event when we're talking about equal rights for the LGBTQ community. And what happens is that in Stonewall, New York, a police raid takes place at a nightclub. And there were laws against homosexuals having these nightclubs, and this raid was violent. And what it does is it spurs this movement. And it takes the LGBTQ or the gay liberation movement, and it pushes it into a very active phase. It becomes a very political phase. We start seeing lots of marches and protests, and very slowly, but it does happen, we begin to see equal rights for the LGBTQ community, which is continuing through today. And we've seen now that same-sex marriage has been seen as constitutional by the Supreme Court. There have been various laws put into place that states have to accept same-sex marriages. And so as the quest for the LGBTQ community continues to have equal rights, we are seeing that those advances are being made. So that's the end of our unit for today on minorities seeking equality in the 60s and 70s.